Huge thanks for having me here. It's very exciting to be back at COP with so many friends. It's my privilege to invite our panelists up to the stage now. Andrew Steer, John Denton, Alain, I believe you're joining us as well, which is wonderful. I think we've got Cynthia and should have Joe Tyndall as well, so please join us on the stage. Big round of applause, wonderful. Brilliant, we've got a full house. This is wonderful, and I think it shows just how important this conversation is at this COP, a finance COP. We heard Ibumari talk about the financing gap. Just as a reminder, we're looking at $2.4 trillion a year for emerging markets and developing economies. That's the climate investment need. We also heard Ibumari use this language of catalyzing. We know that any public capital that is deployed against the climate agenda must be catalytic because there isn't enough public or even philanthropic money in the world to invest in the climate agenda. And the good news is there doesn't need to be, because this climate transition, clean energy, regenerative agriculture, green industry is inherently investable, but you saw Ibumari put up a number of barriers to unlocking that finance in emerging markets, whether it's macro challenges, currency risk, cost of capital. These are challenges which blended finance has some track record in mitigating or managing. But of course, we need to scale what's working. We have to stop reinventing the wheel. Ibumari talked about country platforms as a scalable or replicable solution to help unlock private finance into the climate agenda across various different emerging markets and developing economies. And so it's a pleasure to have everybody here today to be talking about some of those innovative climate finance mechanisms. We are joined by such an incredible panel. It's a privilege to be moderating a panel of business leaders, of philanthropy, of investors, and I hope that you also chase them down afterwards for their insights and their intelligence on this agenda, because as Ibumari said, the whole point of convening today is to collaborate around solutions. So without further ado, I just want to get a bit of a feel in the room, because this is meant to be the climate COP. It is meant to be the climate finance COP, I beg your pardon. It's meant to be all about finance. Should we be here? Do we feel, is there a feeling in the room that it's worth being here and that this finance COP is going to unlock some of that capital which we talk about, the $2.4 trillion a year? I just want a very quick round. I might start with you, John, because I know that we briefly touched upon this earlier. It's worth being here, isn't it?
First of all, it's great to be here and an honor to speak after Mari Pengetsu, one of the true global champions. Special envoy for so many things, but special in your own right. So Mari, it's great to be with you. This is supposed to be the climate or the finance COP. It's definitely worth being here. The challenge I see, to be really candid, and I'll speak very bluntly, is that I don't think enough political capital is being garnered and will be spent to actually enable this to be delivered. We launched, you mentioned the figure of $2.4 trillion is what's needed. Let's be really clear here. We launched a study yesterday to actually try and set the agenda and set the framing of this. You know that climate-related events have resulted in $2 trillion worth of damage over the last 10 years. That is the equivalent of the damage wrought by the global financial crisis. That should be enough to galvanize leaders, but at the moment we've still got we can kick this down the road attitude. We're saying it's right here, right now. This year alone, we're facing $450 billion worth of damage. So you add it up, it's $2.45 trillion worth of climate-related events resulting in that. And think about the damage to individual citizens. If you're in a small island state, and I mentioned yesterday in discussion, I was bailed up by a number of journalists who were new to COP saying, we can't understand why so many small island states are here. Do you know that the actual net damage to a citizen in a country like Dominica is $135,000? $135,000. And it's also $3,000 to a citizen in the US. So this is real. And so that should galvanize the mind. Even if we can't reach global consensus, there's national interest at play here. So yeah, this is the finance COP. But the reality is that unless we as the business community, and frankly the philanthropic community, and the other players force leaders to actually focus on this, we will drift to Bellum very quickly.
Thank you, John. And Andrew, I might go to you. Worth being here? Are we going to get where we need to be? This is the finance COP. What can we expect from the week?
Well, thank you, Catherine, and congratulations to the new Indonesian government. This is thrilling, and the fact that Ibu Marie is now Special Envoy and also Deputy Chair of the Economic Council, the fact we've got 2 new ministers here, congratulations. Indonesia is a crucial country moving forward. On the financing issue, the obvious point to make is that there is no shortage of money in the world. We tend to think, where's the money? There isn't money. There's plenty money. It's just going to the wrong places. So that means that when we wake up on a Monday morning, as a philanthropist, as a financier, as someone that coordinates business, as someone that runs the biggest and most important green fund in the world, OECD here, what we need to think about is how do we tweak the incentive structure so that money doesn't go to the wrong place but actually goes to the right place. And we haven't done a very good job on that. We have lots of seminars on blended finance, but maybe for the first time we actually have an organization, GBFA, that is actually going to bring the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. Now, what tends to happen at the moment, as Ibu Marie was saying, is you tend to have a lot of top-down ideas, good politics, but not very good finance. And the JET-P is a very good example of that. Brilliant politics, very well motivated, but actually if you really want to deliver the hundreds of billions that are required to get the investments in place, we need to be much more professional, much more, if you like, serious. So just a word from philanthropy, and then I think we're going to come back and give a little more details later. So the tendency is to think, well, the governments will do all this kind of stuff here, and then maybe we'll turn to the private sector, and then maybe we really need some grant finance, so let's go to the bilaterals, let's see if we can bring in some philanthropic money. The problem with that is that philanthropists actually have pretty sharp pencils themselves. If you want to get Goldman Sachs to come in, you don't sort of just give them a general story. An important thing to remember about philanthropy is that the reason that the philanthropists have billions of dollars to put into philanthropy is that they're actually very good at numbers. And they actually want to do very serious analysis. So if we want to put things in, the jigsaw puzzle that's required, bring all the players at the beginning. And by the way, that includes carbon markets too. There are dozens of major companies that are willing to put literally hundreds of millions and probably billions of dollars into Indonesia, and we should talk about that a little bit later. So it's thrilling to be here, and thanks so much for this discussion.
Brilliant. I might turn to you, Alan, now, because again, just a very quick rapid fire. What do the big climate funds feel in terms of being at the finance COP? As Andrew said, we'll come back to some detailed and more technical discussions, but we just want to get a feel for the room. What are the climate funds feeling this week?
So the Greek climate funds is the largest multilateral climate funds. We have like 60 billions in portfolio at the moment. Leverage actually additional 62. So we have this leverage effect with a factor which is quite high. And if we go to the private sector, which represents about 40% of our portfolio, we have even higher leverage effect. Just taking the example of equity. Equity is 12% of our portfolio, actually, which is quite unusual for climate funds. And for our equity portfolio, which is about 1.7 billion, we leverage 10 billion additional. The other thing which is important, and I want to come back to the presentation that's been done by Marie Pagès, excellent presentation, because we believe this is the right way forward. The GCF is very much keen on supporting the country-led approach. And we were actually part of this Brazilian platform that has been launched in DC like a few weeks ago during the annual meetings. Because we had also the lessons learned from the JETPs. We've seen what happened in South Africa. I was myself engaged in the Senegal platform. And indeed, as you mentioned, this was way too much G7 led. We need to find a new approach where basically the country leadership is in the core of the system because they know what they need. They know which projects are in the pipeline. And what we can bring is a capacity building. This is what the GCF is doing. We have an envelope, capacity building, 500 million, just focusing on that. So I think we are now we're at the tipping point where there is a new way of working together, a new way of developing country platforms, and the GCF will be at the core of that. Thank you.
Very inspiring and optimistic. And Joe, I'd love to come to you because as we are all hearing the acronyms in the word, the NCQG, but there's this real challenge when we talk about climate finance, about transparency, about accountability, about knowing what money is being unlocked, who's it coming from, where's it going. And, you know, I think we've heard that there's plenty of money, but sometimes it's going in the wrong places. And so we'd love your very quick reflections, including, given this very important COP and the recent OECD work on the 100 billion, and we'll come back to you on blended finance.
Okay, thanks very much. Great to be here. You asked a question whether it was worthwhile being here, and I think the answer is it's the wrong question. It's essential to be here. It is absolutely essential to be here, and trying to shift the dial on the finance issue is the foundational enabler for anything to happen. If we don't do that, we can't deliver on ambition. We can't stave off the overshoot of 1.5 degrees. And super quickly, I think I agree with Andrew. The money's there. It's misdirected. That's its problem. And it's a kind of an add-on, and until we can come up with a new narrative that puts the mobilization of climate finance at the center of things and not just being something at the periphery, we are not going to see the change that's needed and the finance to support the transition flowing properly. So 3 quick things the OECD has been doing. One, we've been tracking the climate finance provided and mobilized by developed countries for climate action in developing economies, and saw that pleasingly surpass $100 billion in 2022, but now it needs to stay there and it needs to grow. One of the things that has come out of that is that still in 2022, even though it grew, there's still pretty much stagnation of the private finance being mobilized. To get from billions to trillions, it's the private finance sector that is just going to have to make it work. And that doesn't mean leaving it to the private sector. We've all got to collaborate and find a solution with the different actors doing so. And the third piece of work, or 2 quick pieces of work. One was we put out a report on the alignment of climate finance with the Paris goals. It's the first one of its kind. It went out last week. It's basically saying it's pretty misaligned at the moment, surprise, surprise, but it's giving a baseline from which we can start to measure progress on that. And finally, on the NCQG, we have done work with the negotiators this year to try and underscore that this has to be about more than a number. There's a mind shift, a new narrative, and a new way of working that has to happen in order to have a successful outcome on the NCQG.
Thank you so much, Joe. And I will come back to you on some of these sort of NCQG points, I think. But I'd love to hear from you, Cynthia, because we have had this comment a couple of times on country leadership, on a country-led transition, and on country-led climate finance solutions. And we'd just love to get your feel, how important is this week for a utility like PLN? What's your sense that this week can do to help unlock that transition finance for utilities like PLN?
Thank you for the opportunity to being such a very honored speakers here. Just to put the context at how relevant PLN in this context with the discussions on the climate finance or the the platform like the Global Blended Finance, Association. So I think for those of you, probably for those of you who have not been so familiar with PLN, so PLN is the sole operator of the electricity provisions in Indonesia. We serve the customers all over the country of around 91 million customers, and of revenues of around 32 billion US dollars. So talking about this, we annually, this year, for example, we emit CO2 to the carbon emissions of around 300 million tons, and if we are not doing anything, then it will go into about 500 million tons by 2030. So by then, we need to really do seriously on how to reduce the carbon emissions. To do this, then we need the investments that we are talking about. Yesterday, our CEO talked about 235 million US dollars by 2040. But for now, I think just for 2030, for the next years up to 2030, we need about 110 billion US dollars. And how are we going to finance this? So PLN has quite a few options. So I think public finance, of course, from multilateral, bilateral with the concessional fundings, but also from private financing. Private financing can come into the form of through IPPs, through independent power producers, or directly through PLN, and also includes this blended finance, for example. And the blended finance in Indonesia, I think Bu Mari has already explained as well. Country-led platform in Indonesia, we have the so-called, the country managers for blended finance, which is managed by one of the SOE under the Ministry of Finance. So we have tried also develop the model within Indonesia from the government perspective, government-driven platform. But on the other hand, there is also a Global Blended Finance Alliance that come across to fill the gap between these public-driven schemes and also the global platform initiatives like GBFA. So how do we do, about this, and how to unlock the financing for about 110 billion US dollars? I think one and foremost is really for PLN perspective is to prepare the right projects. We have hundreds of lists of projects. In the generation, for example, we need about 80 billion US dollars. For the transmission and distribution, we need about 30 billion US dollars, including the backbones, the fish bones, as well as the smart grids. So out of this, how should we finance this, and also how to meet the needs of the investors, like the climate investors or impact investors, to look into what is the economic and developmental impact to any investment that we need, not only for for the projects to become one or part of the energy transitions, but also how to calculate the impact in terms of the economic development, environmental and social impact. So we need that framework as well. So what are the expectations from the GBFA, for example, or kind of investors to get to the right projects? So we need that matrix as well, and for that PLN needs to also have the capacity to develop it. So not only the ordinary bankable pipelines, the right risk allocations, public and private and shared risk, but also what are the other elements, new elements that GBFA or the new investors, new sets of investors, which really concerns about the ESG, for example, that look into our projects, not only on the return, but also the economic and social return for the project. So we don't have that much yet in our framework, but we do have like sustainable financing framework, green financing framework, but that's not enough. But I think how to build the gap is really, this country-led platform is a thing that now is pushing on the capability to develop the right projects, but also communications with the GBFA and also the sets of investors, new aspirations, has to be also put in place. We need to really push more on how to bring the gap and try to have the platform of collaborations and communications more, just to ensure that it's going to be proceeded. With or without GBFA, with or without the investors, I think PLN needs to do, whatever we can do, right? So we do have the multilateral World Bank, ADB, even JETP, we are talking about. So PLN itself, for the financing, for the green financing, for example, we have secured about $2.9 billion. Currently, we are talking with ADB for about $4.8 billion for ETM investment package. And we also talk about this JETP of around $20 billion, plus I think recently we got it $21 billion. But it really needs to get more clarity on what to expect from us. And we also get some, assistance, from all these institutions to ensure that we are able to keep up with what you need, what the organizations of the global platform needs. So I think that's probably the expectation from us. Yeah.
It's always very helpful to talk about a real transition example. And I think John used to be my boss, everyone. So I remember you saying when I was a young grad lawyer that we need to focus on the real economy. And of course, in your role as Secretary General of the ICC, you're speaking to business, you're speaking to investors all the time. And are they seeing this transition as an opportunity? How are they looking at it? And what can some of the conversation that we've just heard from Cynthia sort of translate into them seeing opportunities?
Thanks very much, and you're a very good employee, so it's great to have you here. Andrew makes a very good point, and it's one that we focus on as well. There is actually an appetite in the investment community. In fact, the challenge, of course, is in a way getting the money to the right places. I mean, we're seeing an increasing appetite, but also execution of investment in the transition in advanced economies. But actually, if you look at the numbers, it's actually not going in the right spots for developing economies. That's actually a real challenge, and that's where I think when Mari talks about South-South cooperation, the development of blended finance alliance, it's incredibly important. I mean, the ICC, by the way, we're in 170 countries. 70%'s in the global South. So it's very important for us to focus on that. A couple of the issues is, how do we make this an investment opportunity? Because our experience is that there is not enough charity in the world to deliver this. You actually have to get a commercial return. And frankly, there's not enough money available in the multilateral development banks, and with all due respect, in the bank in Korea. We actually need to find ways to untap opportunities for private capital with commercial returns. And you identify in your slides, Mari, some very important issues, but a couple I would add, if I could. One is that developing and emerging economies need to do what Indonesia is doing and make them more investable. I think the accession process you've entered into with the OECD sends a very clear signal to the global private markets that this is a country that's serious about being investable. I was just working, and I chair finance and infrastructure in the B20 G20. In Latin America, there are only 7 investable countries, which is very arresting. In Africa, there are less. It's why it's disappointing that a country like Brazil is not moving forward faster with accession process to the OECD. These are very important signals. So there are things that developing and emerging economies must do to make themselves more investable. The other issue is that you focus on the lack of regulatory frameworks internal. That could be fixed a little bit by the investability. But there's a broader issue, which is the anachronistic nature of macroprudential frameworks that run counter to the actual ability of the private finance to be made available in developing and emerging economies. I'll give you a very practical example. One of the rules of the Financial Stability Board coming out of 08-09 is that you, as a company, you cannot hold a credit rating higher than the economy in which you operate, which made sense in 08-09 because of what was seen as global financial challenges. But we're in 2024. So a classic example here, there's a company in South Africa which actually has developed the technology to take carbon out of the smoke coming out of factories and turn it into bicarb soda. Pretty amazing. They've done it. They're not waiting 20 years. It actually works now. But they cannot get financing because the company is based in South Africa. So what they've actually had to do is go to Texas, which is where they're actually now operating. That is a South disaster because you actually have the technology and you can't get the financing because of the rules of the Financial Stability Board. Well, I'm sorry, I'm in the private sector. Let's change those rules. I do actually think that one of the benefits of the alliance is that we could actually work together. I've taken a proposition through the B20, through the G20 to change those macroprudential frameworks to ensure that they're actually relevant and contemporary, because that will be helpful. That's bending the financial architecture. That's not getting stuck in a political debate about the reform of the governance of the World Bank. Frankly, that's actually a misdirection of political capital. The political capital's got to go in to making the macroprudential frameworks amenable to untapping that private sector finance.
Thank you so much, John. And Andrew, I'd love to kind of continue this conversation with, I think you used the language, John, of very practical examples. And Andrew, I know you're someone who describes very practical examples. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what you have seen that has actually worked to help unlock private capital into these transition and climate themes, whether that's rules like John was describing or some of the blended structures that you're pioneering at the Bezos Earth Fund?
Well, the most important examples will be what Ibu Marie talked about, which is the sort of country-level platforms. Blended finance works well in individual projects, the successful ones, that is. Not anywhere near enough. But what we're not very good at is the kind of broader country-level and big initiative stories. One of the things that we've been advocating is something we call the dream team for the planet. We're lacking an investment banking function at the big level at the moment. And Indonesia offers a wonderful example, thinking through sort of the country level. If the whole story is how do we move the direction of finance, think of it as a giant tanker in the ocean. You've got to move it around, and we all need to know what is our role in that moving. And most important, governments have got a starting. So, anybody that wants to be part of the jigsaw puzzle needs to start with what is government policy. And what John said is just absolutely right. Government can require certain disclosures, government can set regulations, government can set fiscal policy, government can do all kinds of things. They need to do it, and the starting point must be that. But that's not enough in today's world. You actually need a private sector that's really enlightened, and John talked about that. A private sector that thinks about the longer term and actually can see the writing on the wall and can see the arc of history. And actually investing in yesterday's economy isn't going to do very well 10 years from now, so get with the program. And GBFA clearly is engaging in a very good way with corporate sector, and what you're doing, John and others, is really important. But then in addition to that, you need some sort of de-risking, because to be fair, the private sector can't invest in today's high interest rate, high risk environment. And so there is a very legitimate role, whether it's for the Green Climate Fund, whether it's for bilateral grants, whether it's for philanthropy. Now, when it comes to philanthropy, there's about $10 billion a year that is philanthropic grants for mitigation today. That's a huge increase. 10 billion, is it a lot or a little? Well, it's maybe 1% of what we need. If you add adaptation and you add nature, it's another 10 billion. So think about 20 billion that could be used as grants. My goodness me, that may be a small tail, but it can wag quite a big dog if it's being used really well. So the kind of thing we do at the Bezos Earth Fund, and I have the privilege of leading the Bezos Earth Fund, which is a $10 billion grant facility this decade, set up by Jeff Bezos. And what we try to do is identify how can our money be injected in a way that actually starts moving the needle and changes a system. So I'll give you two examples. One, together with the Rockefeller Foundation and the IKEA Foundation, we set up something called the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. And the purpose of that is to get sort of a reasonable amount of grant money, about $1.5 billion to start with, and then work with all of the key agencies, private sector financiers, World Banks, MDBs, DFCs, and so on, and start doing some serious work. GAP is available to Indonesia, is absolutely keen to engage and already is engaging, and it can put money very quickly into design, but it also can put money into de-risking, providing guarantees, providing subsidies. Another thing we do is we look at the most risky part of a project development, which is the design up until financial closure. That only costs 5% of the total cost of a project, but it is by far the most risky part. And the private sector is often not willing to go into that. So what we had is a lot of grant financing like PIDGE in Africa and others, which have done a good job. But what we're trying to do is bring the private sector into that first design part. So we're taking first loss provisions, we're taking a junior equity position, so we'll take the first loss, but then and often about 40% of projects never reach financial closure. If they don't reach financial closure, we lose our money. But if they do reach financial closure, we share the profits, and the modeling shows that we will actually start getting a revolving fund so that this keeps going round and round and round. That's an example, again, that is active in Indonesia and would love to scale up. So there are some really exciting, I mean, we are on the cusp now of some really exciting developments, I believe.
And Andrew, I just want to stay with you for a second on that, because obviously Cynthia talked a lot about the transition, the energy transition needs, and you mentioned GAP. Where are you seeing some of the early wins of the GAP program on the energy transition? Is it right at the community level? Is it working with the governments? Is it engaging the private sector on this transition theme?
Well, I'll give you an example, not from Indonesia, but say from South Africa, where South Africa was the first so-called JET-P, well-intentioned, not really very well designed yet. And so GEP came in quickly, worked with the President's Office, worked with the National Council on Climate Change, helped them design a financing package, and then asked, what's the real problem? The real problem turns out that South Africa has a political will to switch from coal-powered plants to renewables, but actually the just part of the transition was missing. So what we're doing in GEP in South Africa, I was there last month, we're actually financing the training program. And some very interesting issues there. They were so keen to close a coal plant that they closed it before they had thought through how do you do all the retraining. And so they got into a bit of a pickle, quite frankly. And so what we're now doing is trying to play catch up. They have delayed the next 4 plants that are going to be closed, and they've delayed it smartly because they want to get ahead of the curve, because it's incredibly important that you think about jobs and not only addressing those that are losing their jobs because of coal plant closures, but what about preparing the next generation of those that are needed for the new green jobs? It's sort of thing that OECD's been working on really brilliantly, and we need to launch a major international program on skilling for the green future, I believe.
Yeah, Cynthia, I'd love to get your reactions to that.
I think I'd like to disclose and also appreciate the help from GEP that basically currently we are in the process of having a loan from ADB for accelerated Indonesia clean energy transitions of around $470 million US, and $3 million US grant from GEP is for also one of the things that you're mentioning, project preparations and also just transition aspect. So thanks for that. So basically it's already coming through the system, and thanks for that, and we appreciate that.
Cynthia, let's stick with you then, because you've heard sort of about some of these critical rule changes that are needed to attract private capital in certain geographies. You've heard some of the catalytic interventions that are already working through the system to help with this transition. What more do you need out of this COP? Who are you speaking to, and what are you saying to them when you're trying to engage them on this transition story and this transition finance story? And how could GBFA help?
So I think, again, understanding of the needs of Indonesia to be successful in pushing this forward as one of the global examples, probably. We've heard about this South Africa, and now Indonesia is really at the spot of having these transitions because of these CO2 emissions and the situations in the power sectors. We have around 65% of power productions coming from the coal. And it's really a challenge for us as well. So because not only for the investment needs that we need to have, fill the gap, of the financing, but also our current ordinary capital expenditures also requires a certain capital from the market. Like the the usual global bonds, for example. So from this route, you also have a challenge on, the expectation from investors that they don't, they are currently limited to be able to invest in Indonesia because we have these portions of the coal more than 50%. Because one of the thing that they say is also a requirement from OECD, for example, maximum 30% or maximum 50%. So most of the investors also have their requirements on that. So I think what we need also understanding of the global investors communities that Indonesia cannot go from brown to green, all of a sudden. So there has to be a transition, a pathway. So there has to be transition financing that can also be, accepted by the investors, and that has to be pushed from the global community, I believe. So the terms of transition financing and the requirements from the investors to prohibit them to invest in Indonesia because they like Indonesia, they like PLN credit, so they love the sovereign credits that attach to PLN, and they know exactly that we are, serving the country for the economic development. So there is no way for us not to serve the economic development from whatever resources that we have at this moment, but most important that we understand and we commit that there has to be lower and lower CO2 emission. So our transition plan is already there. So we have our commitment to have this net zero decarbonization journey already, but please help us on, get into the system and how to finance that, and also unleash and get the platform understand that a country like us needs to a certain terms and conditions that are acceptable by them, so they are not being limited from becoming having an investment in Indonesia, and especially for PLN. So that's what I expect. If COP can also be, I think from the financing goals, there's also a certain target for financing beyond 2025. And if it is something also in the terms of transition financing that we are able to get access to, so that will be, that will be helpful. Otherwise, our investors base will be very, very limited. Probably GBFA is one of the solution, because you get all this understanding that this has to be transition financing, but I don't think it's enough, because you mix this philanthropy and also some of the real investors. But on the other hand, we also need to catch a certain market of investors, right? So I think talking about how to help Indonesia transitions for their decarbonization journey, we need to look into how Indonesia would be able to tap the market from various buckets, including blended finance and also the pure investors. And I think the global platform needs to also provide the terms and conditions, or the whatever the the terms that they are able to do, right?
Very helpful, and I'll come back down the end shortly. But John, I just quickly wanted to get a two-hander from you. Are investors interested in transition? Is that something that's top of their agenda, or are they more just wanting green assets?
I sit on the board of one of the largest investors coming out of Australia, IFF Global Investors. We're a $250 billion fund. We're committed to net zero. We are actually investing in the energy transition. The only point I make is that we, as a pension fund, need to ensure the returns are available, so working men and women globally who actually see us as their fund have the right and ability to retire with dignity. So we need to get commercial returns. So we are looking, and Pension Capital, by the way, is very interested in the energy transition, because we love our assets and we're long-term holders. We actually invest in assets and help them transition. Pipelines in the US all the way through. So yes, but there has to be a commercial return.
Thanks, John. And Ellen, I'll come back to you, because you talked a lot about this mobilization ratio, or this leverage ratio, being able to unlock potentially some of the pension capital that John's just talking about. Can you explain a bit more about the instruments that you use to get that mobilization of private investment into climate and transition assets?
Yeah, I come back to that. Indeed, actually, we are deploying all the typical blended finance instruments, like de-risking, risk-sharing instruments. that most of the funds are deploying. But I think one specificity that we have is for sure on the equity side. I mentioned that. And not only in terms of volume, but also in terms of focus. And I'm coming back to the discussion about we need to deliver the right place. I mean, just to give you an example of the green climate funds. I mean, our portfolio is 50-50, very balanced between mitigation and adaptation. And we are bringing the private sector to the adaptation side, which is not easy, as you know. The other thing is in terms of geographical focus. 50% of our investment are focused on LDCs and Africa and seeds. Here again, these are the geography where usually it's very difficult to bring the private sector. Just to finish on the equity side, 28% of our equity investment are in LDCs, in the least developed countries. And here again, it's about like investing upfront at the early stage, exactly where the private sector doesn't go usually, and basically letting it grow. Yeah. Another part that we are like exploring at the moment is all the innovative finance. I mean, we launched again at the annual meetings a few weeks ago, like a debt swap with Barbados, with the EIB and the IDB, and we believe these are kind of tools that could be like deployed at a larger scale. Because with one stone, you can kill two birds. First, you have like volume for climate finance. Second, you're addressing the debt crisis. And as you know, half of the LDC at the moment are facing like the huge debt crisis. A last point I want to insist on. To deliver the right place, you need to use the right channels. And if you compare the different climate funds around the place, most of them are well equipped in terms of finance. They have a lot of concessional finance. The issue is the channels that they're using to deliver on the ground. Most of the funds are working mostly with MDBs, for example. We work as well with MDBs, but we work also with UN agencies which are on the ground, and we work with a lot of local partners, national and regional development banks, local NGOs. We have a network of 130 partners to implement our fundings. Thereof, 90 of them are local partners. And I insist on that because we believe this is the way forward, to get closer to the country.
Thank you. And Joe, we've talked a lot about these kind of catalytic instruments, guarantee mechanisms, first loss equity, but the OECD has put together a list of blended finance principles to make sure that these mechanisms are additional. Can you talk us through why those principles are needed and how they help unlock capital for this transition?
Well, I think the OECD, one of its significant advantages is to provide a convening point to develop what becomes guidance or standards or more coherent and consistent approaches. This is an area, the whole climate area, frankly, is one which is crying out for clearer taxonomies, for guidance that helps to overcome what at the moment is a bit of a mishmash of methodologies that imposes significant compliance costs and is beginning to affect international trade. So putting together guidelines around blended finances is we would see as a core part of our business to help facilitate things and get better coherence across what people are doing. I mean, I think that the OECD, one of the things I wanted to mention was a very successful country-based program. We have the Clean Energy and Finance Investment Mobilization Program, or CEFIM. We've been working very closely with a number of countries on that, including Indonesia. And for that, we work in very close partnership with the individual countries concerned. The government identifies its priority areas or sectors, whether it's solar, wind, hydrogen, often green hydrogen, energy efficiency and so on, for this clean energy transition. We help to develop a strategic roadmap, and then, most importantly, bring together tailored blended finance and other catalytic tools to mobilise private finance for clean energy. So it's about sort of helping a country on an individual basis. But there's a lot of countries in the world, a lot of countries trying to go through a clean energy transition, and that's why it's really important to complement and bolster up what might be being done on an individual country basis with the sort of thing we've been talking about, which is the blended finance principles. We've done principles in relation to a whole bunch of other areas: responsible business conduct, transition finance, transition planning, just to name a few examples, and there are more to come. But blended finance clearly has to be an essential component of making this move to realign finance and really up the game for support for climate action.
Joe, I just want to stick with that, and then we'll get final reflections from the panel. But you heard Alain mention that mitigation and adaptation are key. Does the work you do at the OECD look at both mitigation and adaptation? We know adaptation is tough.
Yes, absolutely, and increasingly looking at adaptation. Again, this is an area that is incredibly fragmented, and of course adaptation is very localised, not just on a country basis, but within countries. And there's a lot of local government and central government work that needs to be done together, and it's not necessarily very well coordinated at the moment. So we have just produced am I going to get this right, Climate Adaptation Investment Framework, the CAIF, a report which starts to try and help bring some order and understanding out of what is frankly pretty chaotic at the moment. But I would agree that because when we have taken our stocktake of finance provided and mobilised by developed countries, the two areas that have stagnated from one year to the next have been private finance mobilisation and adaptation finance. So adaptation finance we really, really have to work on because, of course, frankly, we've let things far too late. The adaptation bill for governments and for the globe is rising daily. And at the same time, we've got to bring the emissions down through mitigation. So the more we can take a whole of government, whole of economy, whole of society approach to dealing with these things and look for the synergies between adaptation and mitigation, the more, slightly less unmanageable it's going to be for all of us.
Thank you. I'm going to run back down the panel now for final reflections. Joe, just because you've got the mic, I'll stick with you. You said it's essential to be here. What should this audience do over the next 2 weeks if they're at COP, given it's so essential to be here on the climate finance front?
Well, people who are here for different reasons, and the negotiators are negotiating. They're in their own little world. I know it because I've been in it for many years and quite glad to be out of it, frankly. Because it does have its own language, its own, atmosphere. And we have to hope and support the negotiators to come up with a good solution on this. It's essential we get an outcome from this COP, an outcome that keeps the process on track, that drives it forward. Because it really is a critical juncture. But for those of us who are not in the negotiating rooms, I think we've got a great supporting act to do. These sorts of discussions and getting on with the business of trying to deliver a transition to net zero is just as important, if not more important. So the two have to kind of be catalytic for each other.
What a call to action. Alain, your final reflections. Biggest climate fund, absolutely got an arsenal or a menu of catalytic instruments. What would you like to see from others at this COP?
I think we're coming to a point where basically we cannot afford going forward with the current architecture. It's very fragmented. We have many players. We have less and less resources. I mean, if you look at the ODA figures, it's dropping. We will have a traffic jam in terms of pledges coming. We have IDA in December. I'm curious to see what will be the figures. And then we'll have the Gavi and the GEF and all the other funds. And actually, the traditional donors are becoming exhausted. So we'll have to think about where we will tap into new source of resource mobilization. And I think we discussed about the carbon market. We didn't deep dive into that, but I think this could be like probably a next game changer. And something else that we are looking at the GCF for sure is also like the new global solidarity levies that are like in discussion now. And we expect maybe some good announcement COP30, hopefully. But we think this is the way forward. So resource mobilization, finding new sources, and the other thing is bringing order in the architecture, because we cannot carry on with 82 climate funds worldwide.
Indeed. Andrew, you said Indonesia was a critical country to this climate finance COP, and I would love to hear a sense of optimism. If you think, are there lots of other critical countries? Is Indonesia on its own? What can we expect in terms of country leadership this week?
Well, look, we are at a really critical stage. There's so much going on, maybe too many different initiatives, too much alphabet soup, too many standards, too complicated. It's not adding up. I mean, let's be honest. Each individual group might be doing a good job in their own silos, but actually the only way we can make this work is by adding things up. And we desperately need leadership. And it is thrilling to see the ideas that are coming out of Indonesia right now. And it's going to be even more important moving by. And it seems to me that all of us, whether those of us sitting up here or our friends sitting there or those listening online, we all need to sort of turn this almost into a spiritual exercise for ourselves. We need to look in the mirror and we need to ask the question, are we doing all we can not to fly our own flag, not to criticize others, but to actually do all we can to make it add up? And, you know, I think hopefully all of us want to make a commitment to each other to do that, and we should hold each other accountable. So we're in, and we are delighted to be working in Indonesia. Are there other leaders? I certainly hope so. We're on a journey from Baku to Belém next year and then on to Australia. We've got some bright spots to look forward to. There will obviously be a lot of discussion this week about what's the implication of the US election. There are all kinds of things that we can do together, whoever sits in the White House.
What a call to action. Thank you, Andrew. John, you started this conversation talking about the damage to individuals, the personal cost of climate change. And I wonder if you could reflect on that in the 2 weeks going forward about the importance of this agenda. It's not just an investment opportunity, there's this real human cost.
Yeah, well, the reason I talk in those terms is that I'm trying to motivate leaders to act. As Andrew said, and I think we all understand, we're in a complex context in which this COP is taking place. And let me be extremely frank, I mean, this COP has not been well set up for success. I think there's a lot of well-meaning, but the linkage between what happened in Dubai, what happens here, what happens in Belém, the so-called Dubai Troika, we need to get substance here, otherwise this will be but a sideshow on the way to the next COP. The substance has to come out of action on finance. And if we cannot get, and I think what our friend from France said was that there's a lot of donor exhaustion out there. Yeah, but there's not a lot of exhaustion in the private sector. Andrew Tall calls for leadership. The private sector has laid down the gauntlet. We are prepared to lead. We just need some alignment around frameworks to allow us to do so, which is where this joining up issue comes in. At the ICC, we're the world's largest business organization. We have a functioning multilateral platform of 170 countries. We are not waiting for governments, we are prepared to act. And the parts of the ICC are committed to a net zero future. What we want out of this COP is not your money, we want your agreement to align the frameworks to allow us to mobilize more private sector finance. Kudos to the global, the Blended Finance Alliance. I was there when it was initiative, now it's an alliance, now it's an international organization. That just shows what leadership can do. We are prepared to lead and we are prepared to put the hard effort in. We just need the governments in a way to create enabling frameworks. That's all we're asking for.
Thank you, John. And Cynthia, you've got the final word. As business engaging with investors and governments, how do you feel at the end of this panel and what do you need going forward?
I feel happy because it's very clearly said, and I understand the situations. But what I hope from this COP is probably three things. One is the out of this COP we get looking forward to seeing a new financial support, more clear and concrete financial support to developing countries like Indonesia, and on how to do our decarbonization journey. And second, the things that I mentioned about more clarity on transition finance taxonomy, transition financing taxonomy. And I think the third that we have not been discussed that much is really a carbon market, because Indonesia, we are now doing, like, for example, for early retirement, for example. So we need to calculate, and to the whole feasibility of the actions needs to also include this carbon market. But I think this is more to be developed in Indonesia. So I think those three things I would expect coming out of this global COP platform. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, we didn't touch on carbon markets enough, but what I heard was there's massive appetite from the private sector for climate and transition assets, and there are also a wealth of country-led examples, and we need that country leadership and that shared South-South agenda. I heard that there are mechanisms available to help unlock this capital. We heard great examples from debt swaps to the ETM in Indonesia to GAP. And we also heard that we need to tackle some of the enabling rules, the principles, the taxonomies, and tackle those barriers which prevent capital from flowing, including the macroprudential rules. We heard that there are plenty of leadership platforms and that we need to join up, and I think this panel was a perfect example of how all the different actors in the system can make the sum of its parts greater, and with everyone here we hope you have a wonderful COP. We've got some real tangible takeaways, and thank you to our brilliant panelists. Huge round of applause.